Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this morning. This is our fourth in our series this morning, of our spiritual enrichment sessions focused on the environment and environmental justice. Today, we make a slight pivot or expansion and talk about environmental conservation. And we start to bring in the rest of God's creation into our conversations through the topic that Matt will be describing for us. So many of you know Matt. Matt grew up in WCC. He's currently the managing ecologist for the woodlands at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Matt did his undergraduate work in plant biology and did his undergraduate work in environmental sciences at Loyola, and his graduate work at Northwestern, where his master's is in plant biology and conservation. So he comes to us well represented or well educated in terms of the field, and has a ton of experience in the field, both at the garden and in the forest reserves where he's been volunteering since he was a youth. Matt has taken his passion for the forest preserves and with Stephen Packard, literally the pioneer of restoration in the forest preserves. They formed a new nonprofit in the state of Illinois called Friends of the Illinois Forest Preserves. Nature Preserves, I do this all the time.
We need a new name.
And he won't spend a lot of time on that, but I want you to be thinking about that when we get to the end, because there's an important call to action that I want you to be aware of and thinking about as we listen to Matt's presentation this morning. So with that, Matt, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It's great to see everybody. This is really nice. I don't get to give a lot of intimate presentations like this, especially in my own community. So this is really nice. Happy to see everybody here. So today we're going to be talking about your habitat. You might learn a few new things about Illinois, the Chicago region, and where we live, and about how it has changed over the years. Part of my professional life and what I've gained a passion for personally is showing people what has changed. By studying the settlers' notes and journals, we've learned a lot over the years of what Illinois used to look like. Illinois is an extremely biodiverse place, almost on par with the Amazon. You might not believe that right away, but the tallgrass prairie comes in from the central part of the state, the northern woods of Wisconsin from the north. We have the eastern forests of the eastern United States meeting us near the Indiana border. And then we have the Great Plains and all their glory as the rest of our state. So we are at the confluence of 4 biomes here in the Chicago region. So, thank you. Liz Kunkel, okay. All right, so let me just make sure this goes the right way. So I'm excited to talk to you about this today because with a group like you guys, I can talk more about the ethic of this work rather than why it's going to cost or make people money, as I try to convince people to do things about invasive species, remove them, care about native species. Usually it boils down to some of the more economic reasons in order to get people to do big things. But there's an ethic behind it all that is really the foundation about caring for creation, our common home. And so that starts with Aldo Leopold, who wrote a land ethic in his book, A Sand County Almanac. One of the essays in there is called The Land Ethic. And that is that we are a part of our land. We are a part of the land. And to most of us, he wanted us to know that as part of an ecological education, in the modern world, most of those who can see it now live in a world that is very much changed from what it used to be. And as an ecologist, he strived to teach people about that, and his legacy continues in the ecologists of today, to teach people about the land. This is a bit of a doom and gloom quote. It does say that an ecologist or someone whose vision has changed to see the wounds of the world must then be sort of alone until educating everyone further. So
one more in it.
Yep. So Thank you. Thank you for watching that for me, Steve. You're right, that is a little hard to do at the same time. So I think the best way to approach this conversation with people is to show people rather than tell people what healthy looks like and what unhealthy looks like. So there are a lot of visuals in here today, some of which you will have never seen, some of which you see every day because they're all around us. So here we have a project that was done by the Morton Arboretum back when I was a GIS analyst. We put this together, which is a map on the left of the pre-settlement landscape. And those different colored polygons are different communities, ecological communities. The green are the forests. The brown that is the background to everything is the tall grass prairie. And the purple are more wet areas like marshes, like the Great Skokie Marsh. You can see up near the Botanic Garden and Winnetka is that purple blob that used to be one of the biggest marshes in the United States. Yep, that's a topic for another day. And here on the right, you can see that really the habitat fragmentation is the most noticeable thing on the right there. This just gives you some background that we do know a lot about the pre-settlement landscape. This is an example of what the tallgrass prairie looks like. Cassie Sari is a colleague who has a passion for communicating the beauty of the tallgrass prairie. So those are blazing stars in purple and all other prairie diversity in there. And so here's another photo. This is what Illinois looked like in that brown area on that map. This is stunning, right? This is June. This is in Northbrook. This is a restored farm field that has been seeded back with native plants from our region. All these species can occur on the streets of the suburbs. They could be anywhere. They are adapted to our climate, but we make different decisions because we just don't know. And so that's part of our talk today, is how to start to shift the way that we think about our landscape. And so here, this is a picture from the early 1900s in Glencoe. This is the impact of grazing. It's okay. So grazing was a practice that altered our landscape further, as well as the plowing of the prairie for the farm fields, for the richest soils in the world, to create some of the most amazing agroeconomic areas of the world in Illinois. And so grazing, this is just another photo so that people can see that there was a significant impact of grazers on the landscape. What you should see here is that there are no small trees. They've all been eaten. And then here's today. We have a new problem. We've gone through grazing and now we're at buckthorn. Now we have a non-native European shrub that is adapted to a different climate that outcompetes everything in our region. And it has a growing season that is longer. It leaves out earlier is another way to say that. So everything is leafing out right now. Buckthorn has been leafed out for almost a month. So on both ends of the summer or growing season, buckthorn has an extra month. Over a century, it was introduced in 1900. So over a century, it has expanded across the region. And it really does like northern climes. As soon as you get to Ohio or south of I-80, it's honeysuckle instead of buckthorn. So there are two. There's a consideration for honeysuckle, but in our region, it's buckthorn. And so here is a side-by-side of healthy and unhealthy. And so this is part of what I wanted to show everybody, because you might see the greenery or you might go to the forest preserves and say, wow, it's so wooded, I can't even see in there. That is actually one of the things that is wrong with our forest preserves right now. They should be opened with dappled sunlight is what we call it. That's the oak woods, pretty sunny woodlands. When you go out east, the woodlands are a darker woodland naturally. They are maple woodlands. And maples are shade trees. Oaks are sun trees. And so the oak woodlands of our region were very open. The settlers wrote that you could race 3 carriages abreast through the woodlands of Illinois. And they did that. So here's, just to drive this home, the Morton Arboretum did a survey of the region in 2010, and then in 2020 resurveyed, and these are the results from the resurvey of our canopy. Our canopy is 36% European buckthorn. Yep, that's over a third.
Just
Oaks.
Stop for a minute.
Yeah. Yep.
So it should have been oak,
It was all oak and hickory
and over a third of it is European buckthorn.
in 120 years.
Oh, wow.
So that's on an ecological timescale, that is a serious problem. For 120 years, many of these trees live for 200 years. So in one generation or half a generation, the landscape has completely changed. And we know that from the way that Europeans settled the world and, went around changing things everywhere they went. We know that things changed a lot, but in our region, we need to consider the ethic of what happened to the biodiversity of North America. The tallgrass prairie is almost gone. There's 1/100th of 1% left. The oak woodlands in our region look like this now.
Matt, just to be clear, I don't see oak anywhere on that.
Oak did not break the threshold of 2% for this graph.
Holy
White
cow.
mulberry, black walnut, European alder, green ash, all represent more of the canopy than oak. This drives home how important it is to plant oak trees. Basically, whenever you're planting something, also plant an oak tree of some kind from our region. So
There's no hickory either, right?
hickory's not on here either, right? So oak hickory was and there's another map I'll show you from the pre-settlement date where I'm gonna try to talk a little bit about landscape fire, and that map shows the cover of oak in the pre-settlement day. So this is healthy again, remember, so dappled sunlight, lots of textures, lots of shapes, young trees, old trees, many species of native trees. This is healthy.
Where was this taken?
This was taken at McDonald Woods at the Botanic Garden, where I work. Yeah, so this used to have buckthorn in it. The buckthorn was removed, the natives were restored, and now the ecosystem is healthier at this point. And yeah,
What are those trees that are growing there right now?
those trees are young oaks, hickories, and a few maples scattered around. Yep.
I really appreciate hearing this, Matt. I love what you say. I love how you say it. I love seeing. I'm wondering if you can elaborate, because I'm really curious about this idea that you said that maples are shade trees and oaks are sun trees. Most of us would think of oaks as shade trees, big, huge canopy, creating lots of shade. I understand what you mean by like a dappled forest, but can you just elaborate how maple are shade and oak are sun trees?
Absolutely, great question, thank you. Yeah, so the key to that answer is when the tree is a sapling. So in order to have a sustainable woodland, you have to have, just like a family, you have to have kids or something to keep the generations going, right? So if a woodland doesn't have any young oaks in it, then what's it going to turn into? It's not going to turn into an oak woodland after the big oaks die. And so young oaks are sun trees. They cannot reproduce in the shade. Maple trees can put thousands of seedlings out in the shade of mother maples. Mother oaks can support enough baby oaks underneath them so that when they fall, they can grow in the gap that was created. But in order for oaks to spread and to continue to radiate around and go all over and represent more than what they represent now, we need more light in our woodlands. And so our woodlands are too dark for oak reproduction. Does that help, Liz?
Absolutely. It also explains why the oak tree that I planted that I showed you last spring, that I tucked in a corner of my yard that I hoped would have enough sun, but it clearly did not. And it didn't survive. And I'm very sorry about that. So I'm going to find a better space and a sunnier space to put my oak tree, because I understand now. So thank you.
Oaks need sun, yep. And what you'll see in our oldest oaks is that they have lots of knobs on their trunks.
Yeah.
Those are old branches from when the tree was growing in the open. And over time became what we call shade pruned, mostly by buckthorn and baby maples that can grow in the shade.
Wow.
And so when they grew up underneath the big mother oaks, the mother oaks dropped their lower limbs because it was too dark for them now. And now all we have are the old oaks. We don't have young oaks in a lot of our woodlands. At the Botanic Garden, my predecessor opened the canopy up enough to get young oaks to regenerate. And from that scientific experiment, we now know that is a requirement for oaks to reproduce.
Wow. Thank you.
So, yeah, so I want to just point to a case study for another type of impact that is occurring on our landscape. In, 1907, I think is when this photo was taken. Yeah, 1907 at Riverside Prairie, which is near Brookfield Zoo. A naturalist at the time took a photo of this, what we call a remnant prairie, a place in the state or region of the tallgrass prairie that was never destroyed, plowed, or otherwise developed. And so these prairie plants that you can see in the fuzzy black and white photo are prairie dock in abundance like that. That's a very slow growing, centuries old plant, believe it or not, that will take over an area if it has centuries. And so our old remnant prairies are usually covered in some of these plants. So you know when you're looking at a remnant. This is a map that naturalist drew of that prairie, and it had woodland up against it, but there was prairie there, probably hundreds of now rare species there. Yes, Eleanor?
I took a course on the history of Illinois, and I know at one time they were afraid that they could not farm prairie, and that's why they had the state capital farther south. Why don't trees grow in a prairie?
Fire. Mostly fire and competition. So prairies are grasslands. Grasslands are usually fire-dependent ecosystems. So we're learning a lot about fire in the 2010s and 2020 with California, the West, and in the Midwest. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, when they have those horrible fires like that with the trees going down like that, are they able to grow back, or they just never get savage?
We are learning. Some of those trees that are burning down are 1,000 years old. So
Okay.
we don't know at the moment what's going to happen.
Okay.
But we do know that suppression of fire or intentionally telling people that fires are bad for about a century, Smokey the Bear, sorry, Smokey, but that led to really dangerous fuel conditions. So pine needles building up for a century leads to uncontrollable fires, which can change the ecosystem, kill the 1,000-year-old trees, whereas a low intensity, more frequent fire, maybe once every 10 years, would have left the ecosystem in a lot better shape. But with the development of the West over the century, and it being a fire adapted ecosystem, like in most of North America, west of the Mississippi River, and the Illinois Great Plains were fire adapted ecosystems. So we had dry summers. We know that we have dry summers in Illinois. That's why the prairie plants have 16 feet of roots in some cases to tap groundwater during the hard months of summer. And so that dry condition naturally leads to lightning fires, or Native American fires was typically the most frequent of the fire sources. The Native Americans were a semi-nomadic people who relied on grassland animals to sustain themselves, and so therefore created more grassland everywhere they could for thousands of years. And so therefore, we have this expanse of prairie across our region that is both a result of climate, the dry summers, where a tree can't establish, and the fires started naturally and by Native Americans. So that's why trees don't grow in prairies, climate and fire. Whereas when you get closer to the Great Lakes were mostly ringed in trees, and that was where the woodlands of our region were, and along the rivers. And so the prairies were really fire dependent, and the trees would sometimes shift in a period of no fires in the prairies and march out into the prairie, and then they get pushed back by fires back into their refuge near water. And so that, I hope, helps with the understanding. So here is this case study where we have a remnant prairie in 1907. This is 90 years into European settlement, and then in the very same place, these photos are taken from the exact same spot.
Oh my God.
That's European buckthorn. So that prairie's gone. It was one of the last remnants in our region. It's been gone. We have other remnant prairies in our region, but that's gone. And so here's another view of it. This is the same place. And so the reason this happened is because at the time, fire was only ever seen as bad. And now you see us burning the forest preserve areas because we're trying to keep these remnant prairies alive. And we're trying to reduce the number of maple saplings that are shading out oaks and outcompeting them. And so the fires in our ecosystems were pretty important parts of the whole ecological,
There's some admit
thank you.
opportunities there.
I'm so sorry. That's a tricky thing to
It
do
is.
both, sorry. Yes,
I just have one comment. We were in Yellowstone in the early nineties, right after that big forest fire.
yeah,
Was the year before. And and we were in there in late spring. I have never seen a more spectacular spring in my life. Because they cleared out all that understory and all these plants that had been there for years and years. I mean, flowers everywhere, masses of flowers across the
yeah.
area. It
We
was
have-
spectacular, really.
We have the same phenomenon here when we burn our woodlands. At the Botanic Garden, we burn that woodland every 3 years. And the flowers are more and more every time we do it. And that means more pollinator resources.
In the early 70s, I joined the Botanic Garden back there when it was just a baby, just off Dundee Road. Anyhow, there were tours every spring. And one tour we took, everything seemed to bloom at the same time. And the floor of the woodlands area was covered with trillium.
Yeah,
It was gorgeous. And then the deer got in there.
Yeah.
And there are no more trillium. Will they ever come back? Is there some way to?
they are back.
Are they?
Yay.
For 10 years now, we've had a deer fence around the whole property,
Thank goodness.
which reduces, it was $1 million deer fence. But it's one, it puts the woodland in a position to be the only research-based woodland in the Midwest that has a deer fence around the whole thing.
That's amazing.
Well.
Yeah, so the trilliums are back.
So these very cool pictures Matt has a ton of, so let's let him
Yeah.
show us some
Sorry.
more.
So, let me make sure. Here. Okay, so we have this problem of invasive species crowding out our natives. We also have another problem in our region, which is monocultures. So having one plant means diversity of one. And when we talk about resilience and we talk about diversity, when we talk about diversity, we are talking about resilience. This is not resilient to anything. This needs to be kept alive with pesticides and fungicides and other things that will make it so that this perfect artificial ecosystem lives. This is another example of a monoculture. This has happened to our woodlands as well. So this is common this time of year. This plant is flowering right now. This is called garlic mustard. You've probably pulled it in your yard. And if you don't, this is what happens. So you do have to pull it or else it takes over. This plant is a classic example of how people coming to the United States from Europe did not understand if they'd have food or not. So they brought food, and some of that was plants. Garlic mustard is a food plant, and now it's run wild around the region. So here's an example of healthy plant diversity. This is McDonald Woods with trilliums at the Botanic Garden. So this is prairie trillium in front, and then the great white trillium in back, and buttercups filling every space because buttercups abhor a vacuum. This, again, is another monoculture. So the reason that I'm showing you these photos is because this is around us. There are few sites that still have the diversity that is healthy. It represents a healthy woodland or a healthy prairie. Much of our woodlands look like this. They've just cleared this out at the bluff at Lloyd Beach, right? If you looked at pictures from Lloyd Beach from the early 1900s, there are pictures of couples, you know, like with the bluff behind them, open, trilliums, bloodroots, wildflowers. Our region has suffered an invasion that most people don't see. And so that's why I start with that Aldo Leopold quote, because to learn this, you then can't unsee it. And you are usually driven to do something about it. And so that's where that connects here.
All of those are buckthorn.
Every one of them. And look how much there is growing on the ground. There is not a single wildflower.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then this leads to erosion.
Sure.
So here's another one. This is a more complex one. This is a native plant called tall goldenrod. It's beautiful, of course. It's a great bumblebee resource. It's a confusing one for us ecologists because it's native. When you tear up a prairie and farm it, like several hundred acres of prairie, this is Middle Fork Savannah Nature Preserve, which is in Lake Forest. This is a couple hundred acres of what used to be an old ag field, which before that was a prairie. And then it was turned into a farm, and then it was buckthorn. And then after the buckthorn's removed, we always get goldenrod.
Oh,
We're learning that if it was an ag field, if it goes from prairie to ag to buckthorn, to cut the buckthorn out, it comes up in goldenrod. And we have likened goldenrod to a scab. It's an ecological, it's an earth scab in Illinois. And what happens when you pick a scab? It doesn't heal, or it scars.
Yeah.
And so we are learning what to do about goldenrod, because this is not good for plant diversity. This is something that is a response to a change that was so unnatural that our native plants were like, just give it to goldenrod for 30 years. And there are some studies that suggest that if you leave it alone after 30 years, the goldenrod will start to decline. And then other plants can start to establish. But this is another thing that we are learning about. You'll see this all over. And you might say, wow, that is a golden field. That is spectacular. From a plant diversity point of view, it's actually a monoculture. And so we are learning how to deal with this one. We know what to do about cornfields. We just have to find a different way to do that. We know what to do about buckthorn. You can cut it out. And if it wasn't an ag field before that, it usually, if seeded with native plants, comes back, like parts of McDonald Woods at the Botanic Garden. And with old ag fields, they turn into goldenrod a lot of the time. So here again is a healthy Illinois savanna. So this is milkweeds and lead plants, yes.
Now, you didn't tell us what to do about goldenrod, is that because you don't know?
I was, yes, my attempt to communicate that we are still learning about what to do must not have quite driven home the point. We don't know what to do about goldenrod yet.
I would say, let's work on getting the goldenrod.
Yeah. What I do and what has worked is you can, and like an old, I don't know, farmer, I use a hand scythe and I scythe it down. And then it grows back slowly, but in the time, other things can grow back as well. Other things can compete. And if you do that for years, there are some places where I've done that where I now see plant diversity coming back. So you don't have to herbicide the goldenrod. You don't have to pull it. You can just cut it down. And if you do that enough times, if you do it twice a season for 2 years, that's the scientific result we got, it does decline very quickly. And then other plants can come in and help diversify the plant community, which then diversifies the pollination.
goldenrod from the field that you side.
We just scythe it down and it decomposes in a few days, usually with our Illinois heat. Yeah.
If you wanted to see that prairie up close.
Yeah.
It's off of Dundee.
This is in Northbrook at Dundee and Waukegan Road.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some prairie, just across
Yeah.
the road.
And the goldenrod, if you drive on Winnetka Avenue between Hibbert and Half Road,
Yes.
there's a, it's full of goldenrod.
And that's an old ag field. Yeah. And that particular place, Steve and I were talking about the other day, because you know how when you go over the river right there on what is that, Winnetka Avenue, right before Half, there's that Buckthorn Forest Preserve. That's the one remnant that's left of the Skokie Marsh, and it's just covered in buckthorn right now. But in the middle of it, there's a marsh. You just can't see it. So a lot of us can't even see into our woodlands right now.
That's
or
a
our preserves.
Winnetka, east of Skokie, as you get towards the river.
Yeah. So,
what's the healthy way to get rid of buckthorn?
yeah, sure. So the healthy way to get rid of buckthorn is to cut it down and then to use a stump killer on it, which you can get at Home Depot, which just makes sure it doesn't grow back. And then you have to take that buckthorn somewhere in the forest preserve, we pile it up and burn it. In the suburbs, you might not be able to do that. So you probably have to get someone to take it away. Yeah.
That's the big stuff, the big buckthorn. What about
The little one,
big
yeah,
ones that-
you should still do the same thing, cut and stump thing, and then the stump killer, and then put them in the yard waste. Otherwise, they'll grow up into big ones, yeah. So some of the results of these invasions and these monocultures in the world and the pesticide used to support them in our agricultural systems is that we are we are in the midst of an insect apocalypse. This is a New York Times article about the decline of insect diversity and abundance in our world. This is mainly the cause for this, and the reasons are complex. There's a lot of corporate industrial economic influence in unhealthy or unsustainable farming practices. In order to get more grains of corn per cent, the elimination of other biodiversity is necessary. And that is not a sustainable way forward. So we are hoping, and people are exploring solutions to this. Second, though, more maybe relevant to us right now, is that Audubon, the famous bird conservation organization, has a 50-year study that says that more than 1 in 4 birds have been lost in the last 50 years. And what does that mean for the next 50 years is really what they're asking. So here's what it means. They made these excellent graphics, so I'll put them up. This is a little doomy and gloomy, I know. We're getting to the part that's a little bit more positive. Grassland birds, as the grasslands of the North American continent have basically been eliminated, are the hardest hit. And if you eat insects, you're also taking a hit right now. 3 billion. And so why does that matter to you? Well, these organisms are not only ethically of value because God created them too, and there's a place for all of us here. That is the land ethic. We are part of the community of this earth, and we can't survive without it, would never have evolved without it. So what else do they do for us besides the ethic? There are specific things, or what we call ecosystem services, that we gain from a healthy natural world. And just some of those are here. I'm not going to go too much into that right now, because I think that with this group, the ethic of why we need to care about biodiversity is why we need to care about ourselves. And with a group like this, I think that that is easy enough for everybody to understand. Whereas it can be a little harder in other audiences. So here's one of those things about the ethic that I'd like to point out. This is a maple invasion. So Liz, this gets to your point of maples. Maple invaded oak woods on the right. That's also McDonald Woods at the Botanic Garden. This is an oak woodland that has had no fire for so long, and we'll get to that in a second, that it has grown up in sugar maple, which is native, but a response to not having anything to thin it out. We don't have the grazers, and we don't have fires. And so, and I don't mean that the deer fence is keeping out the deer that would eat the maples. They would eat everything. And so on the left, we have a healthy open oak woodland where we have removed the maples and we have oaks reproducing. So the key here is sunlight. We don't need super dark woodlands in our region because they don't support the ground level diversity that you see on the left. The plant diversity on the ground, which leads to insect diversity, mammal diversity, reptile diversity. And there's nothing on the ground in there, in the maple invaded oak woodland, which is just like a buckthorn invasion. It is so dark in this part of the McDonald Woods at the Botanic Garden that buckthorn can't grow. The maples are a serious thing too. And why does that matter? Well, because the biodiversity of the oak region, our region, cannot survive there. And that's largely due to landscape changes. We're not going to burn the whole landscape anymore. But the reason you see us burning in the forest reserves is to promote sunlight at the ground level, which promotes the native plant diversity that is the most diverse part of our region, which is the ground level. We might have 20 canopy species. There are 490 species of ground level plants at the Botanic Garden Woods.
What prevents the big trees from incinerating it?
The oaks, the maples do. The maples burn. The maples burn enough to kill them. They don't light up a crown fire like you see out west where the canopy's burning. They burn the bottom enough, and maples are not fire adapted trees. They're from the East Coast. They've moved here with the lack of fire. And so over a century, the maples that were here in some places like the Skokie Marsh, which was pretty fire protected, have expanded. And in other places, they've just moved in. They are technically another invader. But That's largely due to landscape dynamics.
So the oaks are fire adapted.
Here's the slide that points this out. In the 1830s, when they did the public land survey, which was a bunch of people who were trained as botanists and naturalists, walked section lines across the United States with chains on their back. Every quarter mile, they'd stop and write down everything they saw, the soil type, and what might be valuable economically. And through that survey, we have all their notes and we digitized them. And we have now a map of the pre-settlement landscape. Everything in red is the maple woodlands of our region before European settlement. We know they were here, but they were in fire protected areas. In the center, on the bottom right there, you can see sort of in the center of all the green woodlands are a few red dots. That's because the fires would push in, and by the time they got to the center, they couldn't kill maples anymore, or they couldn't thin out maples, we should say, naturally. And so maples had what's called an ecological niche. They were the fire protected trees, but there were not a lot of places in our region that were fire protected. And so you can see mostly along the rivers. And then everything else is prairie that's white in this map. And so this map tells us that our canopy and our trees were oaks and hickories. The green dots here are oaks and hickories. The red dots are maples. So that's how we know what the landscape was composed of as far as trees go in the past. So here to drive that home again, this is that maple woodland, this is the oak woodland. So no fire, maples. Again, understory richness, a typical woodland that is uninvaded by maple or buckthorn will look like on the right. Those are wild leeks or ramps, trilliums, mayaples. I mean, the list goes on. It sounds like a fairy tale if I say it. The names are great. So all these invasive plants impact these ecosystem services. And what can you do about it? So you have in front of you, or we will provide for those online, the Healthy Hedges brochure from the Morton Arboretum. The Morton Arboretum is taking buckthorn eradication very seriously, just like everybody else, but they've provided this amazing guide to what you can replace buckthorn with in your yard. If you lived in Lake County, the Forest Preserves would have knocked on your door over the last 10 years and asked you if you'd like to replace your buckthorn for half, to split the price of doing it with Lake County. People are taking this very seriously. It's been a big impact. It has had a very big impact on our landscape, and people don't know about it. And so by being here and listening and then telling other people about it, you will sort of be jumping on the train of sort of the new hip thing to do with your yard. Because a lot of people are trying hard. A lot of organizations, Botanic Garden, Morton Arboretum, Field Museum, Lake County Forest Preserves, Cook County Forest Preserves, the Nature Conservancy. But it's still a small community compared to the 9 million people in the Chicago region. Native plant gardens go into native plant sales. It's very important for pollinators. One of the most important things for our insects, and in the midst of the insect apocalypse that we are in, is native plants, because insects are typically only able to eat one plant or one group of plants, like the carrot family or something like that. And so if we only have buckthorn, which nothing on this continent can eat because it's not adapted to it, then you don't get any insects, and therefore you don't get any birds that eat insects or any snakes that eat insects or anything really. And even hawks and mice, all the little critters that we live with, chipmunks, they can't live in a buckthorn invaded woodland because there's nothing there for them to eat. There's nothing for them to survive on. And so by providing things for the plants, for the native animals, insects, birds, reptiles to live off of, your native yard, your native plantings in your yard are little biodiversity hotspots. And that's a good thing, but some people may see that as a pest problem. Now you have chipmunks everywhere. Now you have butterflies everywhere. Well, in our ethic to understand our impact on biodiversity, it is important for us to know that we are part of that community, understanding that that community has gifts to share with us. we have the capacity to be grateful. This is something taught by Braiding Sweetgrass author Robin Wall Kimmerer. Humans have a role to play in the community because we are those who are able to be grateful for the gifts of nature. Whereas nature, you know, is just doing its thing. But by observing and learning about nature and having it close to us, like a native plant garden, we can learn more from it. Like that certain animals have so many stages of their life, or that certain birds come back with their same babies to the same spot, like Monty and Rose. Those kinds of things are important for us to understand ourselves as part of a community. And in our modern landscape, we are central to the recovery of that community. So I just kind of talked about a few of these things. One of the things I want to highlight here is the third bullet point, which is increasingly fragmented by human and land uses. So by putting a native plant garden in your yard, you can start to reduce the fragmentation of habitat. So the jump from good habitat to good habitat becomes shorter for these critters, some of which can't move very far. Hedgerows. I like this line here. We do live in one of the places of the world of greatest shrub diversity, but we have shifted non-native shrubs because of culture, because of European culture mostly, that we are descendants of people who for centuries have been passing down the same idea of environment. Therefore, we have European plants everywhere. Here is the difference between native shrubs and European shrubs. And I'm not just trying to make European shrubs look bad. The one European shrub buckthorn that we have everywhere is just a wall of green. And that provides a lot of good privacy screening. That's why buckthorn was selected. It's so aggressive and it's so full of leaves and stems and trunks. It's so dense that you can really screen off an area. But they did that, we did that, our forebears did this because it was easy and cheap. Whereas taming the wild of Illinois with native shrubs was something that was not worth their time at the time. But now we have the legacy of that, which is that most of our native biodiversity is gone or in serious decline. And so by planting these native shrubs, they're both attractive and as well healthy for the ecosystem. And many native insects can use these, which will then attract cardinals and blue jays and swallows and other amazing plants. So people are interested in these kinds of plantings in their yards because they're attractive, they provide wildlife habitat, and pollinators are a serious issue that most people can get behind as a charismatic issue of our time. Soil health, which we are learning more about every day in our scientific research, and how that can impact our suburban lifestyle is an important part of the solution here. And then because that leads to solutions to standing water and other problems, and the problem of carbon sequestration, which is something that we are coming up on in a couple of years here. There will probably be a market for carbon sequestered in the ground in the United States. There's currently a market for that in Europe.
You had spoken about the use of buckthorn as a privacy hedge for residences. But now arborvitae and evergreens are predominantly used. Are those ecologically viable?
Some, yes, some are, most aren't. Arborvitae is native to North America, but arborvitae does provide only the resources for the insects dependent on it. So any shrub hedgerow that you have might benefit nature more if it had more species in it.
Thank you.
But they are a much better solution than buckthorn. Yeah. They suffer from salt in the winter though. You may see a dead one here and there in someone's hedgerow of the arborvitaes. No, a dead four, yeah. And then so the anti-lawn movement is kind of an antagonistic title for that movement. But it is important for me to say one thing about lawns to everybody that will just drive this home, and I will not expand on this any further because I don't need to, I think, unless you have questions. The lawn is the most cultivated crop in the world. Number one. That's it. So instead of lawns and instead of non-native species, you could have this in your yard. And that would have ecological value, connecting places to each other, reducing fragmentation, therefore reducing habitat loss and actually providing more habitat. This is Northbrook. It looks just like it looks like a suburb. You can imagine a house here, a house there. You know, there could be, and these purple plants are called Joe Pye weed. And then there are some black-eyed Susans, brown-eyed Susans, ironweed. There are lots of plants in here that are beautiful and attract pollinators and are healthy for the environment.
Matt, is that tolerant to bus fumes?
Yes,
Could you have it on the parkways of Winnetka?
yes. Liz and I could talk to you more about that if you'd like sometime.
So what does it look like in the winter?
Yeah,
When
in the
it dies
winter,
back.
it looks brown. Yeah,
But it'll stay, it won't just go back to dirt, because I think all the Joe Pye weed I have.
Yeah.
Dies back and I just,
yeah.
dirt.
It's because you just have Joe Pye weed there. If you plant some sedges around it or some grasses, then those will be sort of the matrix in which the Joe Pye lives, or the medium. So we talk about matrix species, and if we want to have a little native planting talk sometime, we totally can. But planting just a Joe Pye weed or just a milkweed is not providing a plant community. It is providing a native plant, and these plants usually survive, or they are evolved to live together. They live together in a community just like we do. And so it's like us being alone. You know, they need their counterparts. And so the best way to do that is to provide a matrix, which is like the grass, a turf, but not a turf grass like you're thinking. We just call it the same thing because it serves the same purpose. It'd be like seeding the Joe Pye into your lawn. It would do better there and it wouldn't look bare in the winter. But if you just plant native grasses or sedges, which are like grasses but lower, then that can provide the ground cover look through the winter. And I'm currently putting together a list of things that stay green that are native through the winter. So that's because I think that's important to the homeowners. Yes.
Highland Park had an 18-hole golf course, at least one of them, that they've abandoned as a golf course. And are they working with the Botanic Garden?
I don't know that they're working with the Botanic Garden, but it was so amazing to walk that and to see a fairway that is turned back into this.
Mhm.
It's incredible. The golf courses are, oh my goodness, there are so many golf courses in the world. And many of them could be, you can get a certification to be a pollinator and bird habitat friendly golf course. And that means less pesticide use and more native plantings around. But when a golf course is abandoned, there's another one, Green Acres, I think. The county tried to buy that for forest preserve land, but they were outbid by a developer. And so these golf courses are great opportunities, and Highland Park nailed it. Highland Park made it happen. And it's really inspiring to go see that because it's just an old golf course, but now it's tall grass prairie this tall. And then in the winter, it's brown. It's brown, decayed, dormant vegetation. But in that dormant vegetation is where a lot of the moths and butterflies put their eggs. And so it's important to consider that the dormant vegetation also plays a role.
But they have wonderful walking paths through. So
Yeah, it's-
Where is it?
Well,
It's
off of Park Avenue, in Highland Park.
Yeah,
Behind
it's the old
the
golf,
the
or
senior center.
yeah, it's behind also the old, or the country club that's right there.
Yeah,
off
which
the
is now
highway.
the senior center.
Oh,
now
okay,
the
great,
links.
okay. So here's just a picture of someone's lawn that has milkweed growing in it, and this is actually Stephen Packard's lawn. So he cuts out a hole in his lawn and he'll plant natives. Up against the house, it's all natives. And then it's not like he eliminated lawn, you know, he just struck a better balance. So up here, you know, on the left at the top, this is sexy these days. The less biodiverse than a parking lot on the right is not sexy anymore. And so biodiversity is a term and a action or a goal to get to these days that is popular. It's not, it's growing in popularity, and therefore it's important for people to know more about why it's getting popular. And so that's what I was hoping to communicate with you today. There are some who relate lawns to deserts, but that's not fair to deserts because deserts are very biodiverse ecosystems. So what else can you do? Besides native plantings, replacing your buckthorn. Well, you can volunteer. This is how I got involved. Volunteering in the preserves provided me a place of belonging, that, you know, another place of belonging that I felt a lot of energy and interest toward, and met a lot of people who I really like. And so by removing invasive species, we're opening up the environment where it had been invaded to then re-sow the native environment back, the native plants that then attract. And it is a truly, if you build it, they will come. If you put one native plant in your yard, I bet you have butterflies on your Joe Pye weed. And then if you put a milkweed, you're going to get a milkweed caterpillar, or a monarch caterpillar, sorry. Like, it's funny how the native, there are so few native plants around that the organisms looking for them find them, because that's what they see, you know, they're adapted to that. For example, bugs, bees can't see the color red. So if you have a red flower, you know that it's intended, it has evolved to be pollinated by a bird, because a bird sees red. An insect can't see red, but a bird can't see UV, but a bee can see UV. We know that now. So a lot of our flowers, we've been putting a UV lens on our cameras and looking at them. Amazing science. The patterns on the flowers of the UV radiation is amazing. So we know that these native insects and birds and animals are looking for our natives. So here's another thing you can do. This is an important, it's been called the most important conservation issue in Illinois in 20 years. The Rockford Airport is currently trying to expand, which makes a lot of sense. The Rockford Airport needs to expand, but they have this funny yellow polygon in the middle of their expansion plan. It's an 8,000-year-old prairie. It's been there since the glacier retreated. And it could be the highlight or centerpiece of their airport. And so a coalition of conservation organizations has formed to save Bell Bowl Prairie. Bell Bowl Prairie was named after the bowl that it's sort of the feature of the landscape is kind of a bowl, which we can show you here, where it was an army base at one point in time. And so after the war, World War II, the airport got the land, and the airport board cared about the prairie for 70 years. And recently the airport has decided that they would rather have the gravel that's under the prairie for construction and to get the prairie out of the way. With 1/100th of 1% of the original tall grass prairie left, these 14 acres represent 14 of 26 gravel prairie acres left. More than half.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so, and on the right-hand side is the higher quality prairie that survived, which is 5 of 18 acres in the state are at the Rockford Airport, and they are going to bulldoze it down. And to drive this home, the Union for the Conservation of Nature declared temperate grasslands the most endangered ecosystem in the world. This is one of these other things that I like to lead presentations with. You don't know it right now because it's been gone for our whole lives. Our great grandfathers and grandfathers and grandmothers had the tall grass prairie. We lived in the most endangered ecosystem on the planet. And that's not an exaggeration. That's backed by science. It is true, because when you drive across Illinois, what do you see?
Cornfields,
Corn.
bean fields.
That's it. You see
Corn.
corn. It used to be tall grass prairie as far as the eye can see. Yes.
I have read that people are healthiest if they eat things that are native to their area. So how do we accomplish that?
That is a great question. I think that we need to start looking into traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, Native American knowledge of the environment, to understand what food sources could be viable options in that kind of scenario. It is true that plants that are adapted to an area do best in that area. And if you bring in plants that you're going to farm for food from a different area, it might not be as good or healthy as it would be in the area that it's from. But I think that there is something to say for just changing our practices with some of the same foods, rather than changing the food sources or the food types. entirely. The agricultural crop can stay the same and still be sustainable. We can still grow corn and soybeans, but they used to rotate farms on 8 crop rotations, throwing in grasses and oats here and there. Now we just rotate corn and soy, corn and soy.
For
And a lot.
hundreds, yeah, for hundreds of years in England, every 4 years was a different crop.
Right.
Which is why on that limited land they had in England, for hundreds and hundreds of years, people ate.
Yeah.
Well, see, my grandfather rotated crops because there were no pesticides. There were no herbicides.
That's how you.
They rotated crops, a way of managing in the ecosystem.
In
But
this
that's what's
condition,
gone now.
right here. Is there no group that's trying to fight this?
We are, yeah. So the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves, the nonprofit that I co-founded with some people, the Natural Land Institute, Sinisippi Audubon, which is the Audubon Society out in Rockford, the Field Museum. The amount of organizations that have signed on to support Belleville Prairie is over 100, includes the Botanic Garden, Morton Arboretum, Field Museum, Shed Aquarium,
And
all the big
and
ones.
what kind of clout do they have compared with what is bulldozing?
Could you ask that a different way? Sorry.
How much clout in proportion do all of your groups hoping to save this have against who wants to bulldoze? What?
Very little, I guess, if I understand the word clout correctly. We don't have a lot of power in this fight. The airport owns the land, and currently the Endangered Species Act, there are several state endangered and federally endangered plant species. And this is interesting to people who like history. Our Endangered Species Act is based off of Old English law where animals are public property because they can move across boundaries, and plants are private property because they can't, which is a ridiculous thing to say because invasive species have moved everywhere. And so through that understanding of the law, through that interpretation, plants have always been like, you just have to do paperwork to kill endangered plants.
So
That's
they're
it.
victims.
They're victims of, and so the Endangered Species Act is great for a lot of reasons. It was written in 1972. So we have come a long way where things may have been protected under the Endangered Species Act, but now how are they going to persist? And at the same time, they're not even protected in a lot of cases. The only reason this project stopped for how long it has stopped is because they found a rusty patched bumblebee, which is a rusty patched bumblebee,
Can we
which is
explain
the
more there?
which is the only bumblebee that is listed as endangered.
Oh.
And so, yeah, the fact that they found an animal stopped the project.
Good.
I think it's fair to say.
Until they declare that this is the line in the Endangered Species Act. The action can go forward if the action does not jeopardize the continued existence of the species. If there's one left, you can't do it. If there are 2 left, you can kill one.
Oh.
That's how the law's been interpreted.
Is there any if you took a core sample of that original prairie, is there any difference between a core sample of an original soil versus a well-kept prairie? Is there some sort of fetal cell in there that would be interesting?
Oh, yes. The soil dynamics and biodiversity of this site are unlike any other in the state. We don't know what implications for industry, medicine, agriculture are in that soil. And we're learning right now so much about fungi, bacteria, the microscopic world, microorganisms. And if we want to go from these rotating corn and soybean agricultural practices to more perennial no-till practices that sequester carbon because you're not tearing the soil up every year, we need to understand how perennial or long-lived mature grasslands live. We don't know how a prairie can survive for 8,000 years, but it definitely has something to do with the microorganisms in the soil, many of which we don't know anything about. And before we erase this library, we really ought to do some research.
And I have a feeling that we could go on
I know.
for weeks with.
Yeah,
But I want
this is
you
the
to
last
get to
slide.
this.
So this is the last slide. Here's some 5 first steps about what to do about this. Sometimes it's a little doomy and gloomy. I tried to pepper in some happy stuff. One of the biggest things you can do here is on the bottom this year, the Forest Preserve referendum that is coming up on your ballot in November. is one of the 5 biggest referendums in Cook County history. The last one of its size was in 1930. It is $1 billion over 25 years to fund restoration in the forest preserves, which now many understand is a good idea and needed, and to fund and support more training of individuals who got the training I got. And so when I started in 2017 in this work, there were 5 crews. They're hoping to triple it and then triple it again over time, over the next 25 years, to get more crews to address this problem and train more people in this job. And so the Forest Preserve referendum that's coming up in November is almost a sure thing already. I mean, the League of Women Voters signed on, and they vet everything. So we have great support, and just to let you guys know that this is happening, I think that's one of the biggest things that you can do. And then there's all the things I talked about.
There is one other thing we can do, Matt,
Sure.
and that is we can learn more about your organization and help to support it in the work that you're doing. Because what I think I've taken away from our time with you this morning is how important the work is and how important volunteers are to the work that you're about.
So for a long time before this referendum idea was volunteers were doing this. The workforce was volunteers on the weekend or whenever they had time. And now we're trying to make both volunteers and a larger professional practice. Yeah. And so just to leave you with something nice, this could be your backyard. These are low.
This could be our backyard. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Matt, thank you so much for spending your time with us.